Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today I've got a fun video for you guys. This isn't going to be one that's going to have a ton to do with the real life team or what's actually happening. But we're going to put a little bit of my philosophy and my takes on things to the test, because I'm going to be doing a mock rebuild for the Jacksonville Jaguars, not just this offseason, but for the next offseason and the one after that, and going for a long time, hopefully, on this channel. And you can follow this on Twitter. I will have updates on there as well. But the idea of this is starting from the end of the 2023 NFL season, the loss to the Tennessee Titans, seeing what my decisions for the team in real time as things happen would end up doing for the team, where they would end up, what players would work out, what mistakes would be made, and hopefully by the end of it, to become a little bit better of an analyst and a smarter person, because there are going to be mistakes in here. There are going to be bad decisions. There will be some really good ones too, I hope. And I'm curious to see if I can get this to a point where we can build a really damn good team. But this is all for fun. I'll make that clear. This will have nothing to do with the real life team or any actual news. So if you see someone signed on here, it doesn't mean they're actually signed in real life. Maybe I made the same decision. Maybe I didn't. But it's all going to be for fun. So that's what we're doing. Now, you may ask, how different is this from maybe the mock off-season videos that we did earlier this off-season? The difference is effectively just that this is going to continue. So when we get to year 2, a year from now, we'll be working with the roster that I had at the end of this season. So if I make a mistake, if I make a poor decision, maybe I extend someone that really didn't earn an extension and it's the wrong decision, I have to live with the consequences of that. I can't just go out and say, well, 80% of my moves were great and I'm only going to talk about them. I got to deal with the 20% that were bad, or maybe it's flipped, maybe it's even more. But that's going to be how this works. So before I jump into all the things I did this offseason and get into the details, I want to talk about kind of what the plan is here. Because there's very much a thought process going into this on how I wanted to build it, kind of a timeline, and what the goal was for this team. Now, I agree with some of the initial decisions the Jaguars made this offseason. I thought the Ryan Nielsen signing, for example, was phenomenal. It was one of my favorite things they did this offseason. I think he was the best option as a defensive coordinator. But my philosophy for how I think this team can succeed and what I think the problems were last year and how I went about addressing that were very different than the team. And, they might end up being wrong. We'll see. But to me, the top issue at the end of last season that I saw, obviously Trevor Lawrence was hurt, right? You could throw that out there at the top and say done. But the offensive line and somewhat the defensive line too, especially on the interior, were poor. Lack of physicality, lack of dominance. These were offensive line, or these were trench units, we'll call them, that struggled. They were not imposing their will. They were not dominant. They got bullied at the end of the year, specifically the offensive line, though. You look at some of the teams they played some very good opponents, right? We're talking about the Cleveland Browns, we're talking about the Cincinnati Bengals, Baltimore Ravens, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Tennessee Titans at the end of the year. I'm going to throw into this too, because the key thing you're going to find between all of those teams, and even Carolina a little bit if you want, is they have really good defensive lines. Now, Carolina, I mentioned that for Derek Brown, and that's kind of it. Brian Burns isn't there anymore. But when Jacksonville played against really good defenses, against teams that won in the trenches, or at least challenged you in the trenches, that was where you saw them crumble. They got Lawrence hurt 3 or 4 times at the end of the year. So that is one thing I very much want to address. Another thing that I have mentioned since the beginning of time on this channel is that I think the Jaguars have seriously neglected the run game. I feel like there is a ton of potential with Travis Etienne, and I think if he had a great run blocking unit, that he would be able to lead the NFL in rushing yards. Not saying he would, but that he could. I think he has that potential. And with running backs, it changes most years, right? You very rarely have a back-to-back rushing leader, at least in recent years. Guys fall off, guys come up out of nowhere. That happens. But I think Travis Etienne is a phenomenal player who has been successful in spite of the surrounding cast. And so I wanted to build an offensive line, ideally, with this rebuild that was going to be able to be dominant in the trenches. That was the first thing to me. Outside of a quarterback investment, I think that the offensive line play is arguably the most important thing on a team. I wanted to build up the defensive line, though, too. I wanted to get great players there. I look at how teams have beat, for example, Patrick Mahomes. Look at the Bucs. They were sacking him. They were getting after him constantly. Even though Mahomes was able to keep his head together for the most part, he could not complete the throws because he was being chased every single play. You look at how the Bengals made it to the Super Bowl. It was getting pressure on Patrick Mahomes. This is the key thing you see, and I think a lot of these strong trench teams are consistently among the best. And so to me, these are the priorities when you're building a roster. And even if you are not complete everywhere else, that is going to be something that's going to allow you to elevate your team and to be a playoff contender and to be one that can win in the playoffs too. I think the way Jacksonville's done things, especially with the offensive line, it's a very athletically focused group. It's a group that is going to be used a lot in zone, used on the move in general. They do run a decent amount of gap, to be fair. But it's a team that is very focused on the athletic side of things. You don't have maulers on this team aside from really Cam Robinson. And Robinson's been out a lot. So that was very much an emphasis for me. One of the first things that I wanted to focus on, not that every decision had to be based around that, right? Because you want to get best players. And I think one of the things I wanted to focus on too with the draft is that you want to take the easy opportunities. You want to take the layups that you're given. You want to take the guys that are clearly going to work out, clearly going to be worth the pick. Don't overthink it constantly, because that's where you make mistakes. That's where your team has depth issues. So these are all things I'm looking at. And if I'm looking at a team to really base this off of, talking about the offensive side of the ball specifically, I look at a team like the Detroit Lions. It dominates in the trenches. They have a great run game. They have players that go there and are extremely successful running the ball because they have a great unit around them. Jared Goff has become a significantly better player and earned a $53 million a year contract in large part for the fact that he's not getting hit all the time. He's able to process and make the right decisions on the field and to be successful and to take his team nearly to a Super Bowl. I think, in fact, that might be the team who wins it this year. So that is an example of a team that I want to base this off of and the way I would want to build Jacksonville's offense over time. So that's kind of my general thought process. And 2024 to me, even though the Jaguars have answered some of these questions, and maybe a little prematurely, I've alluded to that a little bit, talking about Trevor Lawrence and the contract, and that while I'm confident he'll be the guy, I'm not at 100%. I would have waited. But that's all done, right? I felt like 2024 needed to be a season where the top priority, and of course you're still going to compete, of course you're still going to try to win, but it's about getting answers to some of the big questions. Is Doug Peterson still a Super Bowl caliber head coach? Or are the Press Taylor issues going to lead to a similar demise as what happened in Philadelphia? Is Trevor Lawrence going to have a complete season without having excuses? And given, I have to say this once again, I've said it when I've talked about the excuses, they are valid. They are legitimate excuses that make sense. I am not disagreeing with them. But there are still excuses, and to me it felt like something where I can't pay a player top of the market, top of the entire league, when most of their career involves excuses, even if they're legitimate. And I would have waited. Just my thoughts, but hey, fully support him. He signed to that extension. It's got to work out. We want that to happen. But this is my mock rebuild. This is going to be the way I would have done things, and we'll see what's right, see what's wrong. But that's kind of my thought process here. That's what I want to focus on this year. Final thing to mention, the salary cap situation for Jacksonville is not good right now. And you'll hear a little bit about that if you go watch my salary cap video. If they are going to keep around the players that they have right now, especially those guys entering second contracts, the amount of money they're going to be spending each year is going to be insane. They're going to very quickly be pushing a lot of money down the road. Going to have a lot of future void years and cap hits for players that are not on the team. And they're going to have some big cap numbers. They're still going to be coming in for these seasons. I think it's something that probably at most is sustainable for a few years. If they go past that, well, it might be the New Orleans Saints, to be fair. But that's one thing I wanted to focus on too. In this offseason, I wanted to be able to kind of reset. I wanted to fix the cap space. I wanted to get rid of void years. And I wanted to find a way to do that while still having a competitive team, primarily through trying to nail the draft picks. So that's your synopsis. That's what I want to focus on. I've taken 10 minutes talking about it already. We'll go ahead. We'll jump into what I actually did here. We'll build off this. First thing first, fly through this really quick. Front office moves. You got the cringy line saying I hired myself. I'm basically playing GM in this, but same decisions, right, as the actual team. Obvious differences. In the mock rebuild, I'll be making decisions, and so Trent Baalke's gone. Praise the Lord. But I didn't feel like there was anything else that needed to happen, right? Press Taylor was a conversation. But for Press Taylor, I think the replacement would have been the same guy, essentially. Not that Press Taylor would just come back in the building, but Doug was just going to get someone who was going to do the same thing. They are basically a pair at this point, and I don't think it does much good firing him, because I think if you're moving on from Press Taylor, you're moving on from Doug. And I just don't think there's an impact if you just get rid of Taylor. I agreed with the decision with Mike Caldwell, of course. Leaving early, especially in Week 18 when you need to make the playoffs, when you need to win the game, not taking the amount of time you need to and slacking off, having a defensive meltdown at the end of the season, pretty good reasons to get fired. And Ryan Nielsen, hey, like I said, I agree with that decision. I thought he was a phenomenal signing. The one guy that I had above him on the list, and it was practically tied, was Jiro Evero. I believe he was retained by the Carolina Panthers. Nielsen was the one who was allowed to interview outside of the organization, thankfully, when Atlanta was getting a different guy in. So, same office moves, basically, other than the obvious that, I'm going to be running the show in this. Now, going on to the next part, we're going to get into players. We're going to talk about guys that were released. We're going to talk about guys who were extended, and then some of those like pre-free agency moves. So getting into releases, some of the same guys here. Same guys who got cut in real life, I did. I threw on a couple guys, though. You've got Fatukasi, Jenkins, Williams, and Zay Jones that were actually cut in real life. Zay Jones is also a late one for me. Brandon Scherf was one where I understand why the team's paying him $10 million, and I think that'll be all right. But to me, he's a player who's getting older. You have cap issues. It would have been a priority for me to find another way to get a starter there. And I think you could have even signed a relatively cheap player, I'll prelude to who I signed, but a Greg Van Roten, who started for the Raiders and actually played pretty well, and he only earned like $2 million last year. I think you can get that kind of player and get by for a year and kind of help your cap situation out. Now, that's not the all-in approach, right? But that's not really what we're doing here. So Scherf was a guy that I was considering moving on from, and the cap hit was just too much for me. And I just preferred to redo that. I preferred to get in someone that was good in both the pass game and the run game. Now, Cam Robinson. We'll see his name again here in a second, but this was a situation where, and I said this earlier in the offseason, Cam was a guy that I would have just told, hey man, we'd love to keep you, but this number's not working. We can't pay you this amount because no one else is going to pay you this amount. And I wouldn't word it like that, right? It only be insulting to a player, but this is the basic logic, right? No one else is going to pay him $18 million a year, especially with 2 years where he missed a lot of time. He's been injured. He's had the suspension for trying to get back earlier. Trying to reduce his injury time was the reasoning. And so those are all issues and why you wouldn't pay him top of the market. And so my thoughts with Cam Robinson were, you let him go out in free agency, you let him see what offers he's going to get, and to a point you match it. I think that's fine. And I think you can also throw in a lot of incentives, and Cam could earn close to what he did before, but your cap hit's still going to be much smaller. So I'll explain what I did there later, but he was a guy that was cut just before free agency. Darius Williams was one I wanted to trade. Just wasn't going to be a scheme fit. Love the player, though. Wish we could have kept him, but it just didn't make sense, right? They weren't able to trade him in real life, so I assumed that they could not trade him, or I could not trade him in this scenario, and they probably tried. So I went and cut him. Always going to try to give benefit of the doubt to worst case scenarios, so we're not just giving me layups and making this easier. CJ Beathard was another release. This was just because Mac Jones, I traded for him. You'll see that in a moment. And so there wasn't really a reason to keep all those quarterbacks on the roster. So that was kind of my thought process there. And my best move out of all these, I just listed the same one as what I did in the grading for this offseason, which was Restructures Jenkins. And the reason why I listed that, it's nothing personal against Restructures Jenkins, but it was the logic of how you got there, right? You got a really good value in Antonio Johnson. You got a legit good starter deep into the draft. You sat him for a year. He got to play late in the season. He proved himself, and you make the right decision to move on from Restructures Jenkins and to get that young starter in for those 3 years where he's not going to get paid a lot. And he can go earn his money after that, and that's going to be awesome for him, and I'm excited for that. But this is an ideal situation, right? Moving on from an expensive veteran for a young guy that you picked up deep into the class that's actually a good starter. That's perfect, right? That's how you want it to go. It doesn't happen all the time, but as many opportunities to do that as you can, you want to do them. So that's why that was my best move here. Now, extensions and restructures be our next part. So big difference here. And I have to explain the timetable as well because that's important in this. The Jaguars in real life had a scenario where they essentially had to use the franchise tag on Josh Allen unless they could extend him before the deadline. They played hardball. They weren't able to extend him, and they end up doing it way later in the offseason. Ridley couldn't get the franchise tag. Ridley decided to walk to the Titans. Worst case scenario, right? And we're not even talking about like whether or not you should pay him what he earned, right? But you should have been able to franchise tag him. And it was just played out very poorly by the team. There was always a simple solution to this, which was to pay Josh Allen what he's worth, not wait a month to go talk to him and get the damn deal done. Like, he was going to earn a lot. You knew what the number was. We all knew what the number was. What I ended up guessing the number was exactly what it was. So I did that deal immediately. That was the first thing, in fact, out of this whole rebuild I did. So Josh Allen, $150 million, 5 years. That's fully guaranteed. Technically slightly more in the actual team because some of that money, I think it's like $9 million or so, is incentives, but not a huge deal to me. Josh Allen's worth it. I don't think I'm going to be complaining about it too much. Now, what that allowed me to do, of course, was to franchise tag Calvin Ridley. We'll see what happened there as far as his future with the team. That'll be actually on the next slide. But that was the decision I made as well, and gave you control over where he goes, right? So he doesn't just walk to a division rival and you have something to say about it. Now, had some other moves here, some of them actually taking place. So yeah, Daniel Thomas, real life, he signed a $4 million 2-year deal. Just ended up throwing on an extra year for this. So $6 million over 3 years. Dearness Johnson is someone that, he's obviously not a focal point of the offense, right? But his film in Cleveland, his moments when he had to play really excite me. Someone I liked. And I didn't really see myself drafting a running back, so I figured let's bring him back. Paid him $1.25 million to be safe, a little bit over base salary. Could have saved a little bit there, no big deal, right? And then you get into the secondary. You get into these guys coming off their rookie contracts, 1 year left. I went ahead and took the bet on them. We'll see how that ages, but I really believe in Andre Cisco and Tyson Campbell. I think these are two great young players that have been plagued a little bit by injuries here, but I don't think that defines who they are. I think that Tyson Campbell is going to be really good in this scheme. I think he's a top-tier cornerback. I think he's going to join that group after the season. And I think Andre Cisco, when I look at him, is a guy who has consistently stepped up in the biggest games. Pick 6 against the Eagles when the team was 2-1 in 2022, trying to take on the only undefeated team left in the NFL. Somehow, the Eagles were the only team undefeated at 3-0. Don't tell me how that happens, right? But that was the case. You look at Andre Sisco against Mahomes, picked them off twice, I believe. Had some huge hits in those games that, you could say they're a little questionable, but he set the tone in those games, and I think they were generally legal. They weren't plays you would get ejected on, but he stepped up his game in the big moments. And that's what really sells me on Andre Sisco, and him just being someone who can change the tide of a game, who can get that big play and flip the script. And so I'm a huge fan of his. I think he should have been extended yesterday. I ended up going with $15 million a year. Maybe it's more than what he'll actually get. We'll see. But I just went with a number I felt like was probably around what he would earn. And then Tyson Campbell's a little bit more, $16.5 million. But the top of the market's about $20 million. A lot of players in that range. I think Campbell right now is just under that upper echelon, which is a big group of guys, right? But he is a top cornerback. And I felt like this was a decent contract. The numbers are going to go up here soon. And I wanted to get ahead of that on certain players that I felt like the worst case scenario wasn't going to kill you, right? Both these deals were 2 years guaranteed as well. So you have this 4th year of the rookie deal, and you have 2 more on top of that get guaranteed. So you have at least 3 years with Sisco and Campbell on this team, unless you're trading him or doing something like that, which not the plan, right? And then Foye Oluokun, same deal as in real life. He ended up wanting guarantees in return for taking less money. That's a great deal. He's a phenomenal player. Easy to do that, right? And then the final one, forgot to list running back, but you know he is. Travis Etienne. This one might be too early, but my thought process here is that I want this team to function heavily around Travis Etienne. He is not necessarily the entire offense, right? But I think he is a guy who could keep this offense going and can be one of the massive focal points of it, along with Trevor Lawrence. So I figured get in on that early. This is effectively 4 years that you have with Etienne. He's only played 2 in the NFL. I think he's going to make it through that, be a great player that whole time. Let's get the cheap price right now, because I really believe in what he can be and what he is already. Maybe that's the fantasy football side of me talking, but I think he's a great player, and I was comfortable making that bet right now. And then going on to the next part here. So those are all our extensions. No restructures, right? So didn't have any of that. What I will actually mention really quick before the next part, void years. Something to talk about here. I removed all void years for the players. So what I did essentially was I took bonuses that were going to be paid out in the future against the cap. They've already been given to the player, right? I removed those years and I took the money, put them as much as I could on this season, and what I couldn't, I put onto the 2025 season. So a lot of this money is getting pushed out of the way. For example, Christian Kirk is about like $5 million or so, I think, that I pushed onto this season so that there's no void years to worry about down the road. That's not something I want to use. I don't want to be in that game. I would prefer to have a lot of cap flexibility so that if my team gets close, I can go make those big moves, take the next step, and hopefully go win a Super Bowl. But we'll see what happens, right? So just something I mentioned here. Did that with quite a few players. So a lot of bigger cap hits this season. But going on to the next part, offseason trades. Another long list here. So I ended up trading 4 players away, and I acquired 3 players. So first move, same move that the Jaguars made in real life. Mac Jones for $193 was a solid deal. Now, if I had known who I had drafted, I wouldn't have done this, actually. I would have probably picked up a kicker. But no way of knowing the future, right? And I felt like it's a solid deal. My bet here is that you get a decent backup, and then you can end up watching him maybe get you a compensatory 6th in next year's free agency. That's the goal. I don't know if it'll play out that way, but that's what I would hope for. Now, the big topic of conversation here is Calvin Ridley. Because the immediate thing that some people will say is, why would you trade for him? He costs so much money. Here's kind of the logic. And this ended up being the New England Patriots that I did. The Patriots weren't able to land him on the open market because they had competitors. There is value in giving up a pick to get Calvin Ridley and negotiate the deal without anyone else interfering. We saw the numbers skyrocket for Calvin Ridley. We saw them go up from what was apparently like 18 or 19 million all the way up to 23 million a year. So you'd have to imagine that even if they got to, pay that $22 million price for the tag and then whatever it's going to be from there, Calvin Ridley is going to earn less getting traded in that scenario. And so that's value for the Patriots, a team that wanted to surround their young quarterback that they ended up drafting. And Drake May didn't have him at the time, of course, but that was their plan. And so I felt like this was a solid value, especially because they had some big-time free agents that were on the market at that point. They didn't know if they were going to keep him or lose him. Mike Onwenu is a big example of that. If you're signing Calvin Ridley on the open market, you might not get the comp pick for Mike Onwenu, who would have, I believe, been a third, might have been a fourth. So there's the value there in bypassing it. It might actually just be worth it on its own. So there were some different things that kind of led into the value. I didn't want to go into the third round. I felt like that was maybe a little too much because if you're trading him, it's kind of clear to teams that you're not planning to keep him. And so the value is not going to be super high. And there were questions with Calvin Ridley, of course. You got to pay him a bunch of money. He's an older guy, but he's still going to probably be 1,000-yard per year receiver. So that's where I found the value. I ended up doing 103 with the Patriots and ended up picking with that pick. Now, other trades here, Walker Little for 139. This was to the Commanders. I felt like this was a very obvious trade. The Jaguars have just clearly not planned for Walker Little to be a starter, and he's just been that guy who plays wherever the heck there's an injury, and that's been anywhere but center, basically, or right guard, actually, even though Brandon Scherfs went down for parts of games. So Little's just kind of been shafted in Jacksonville. And I figured with 1 year left and some players I could target in the draft, plus guys in the market that were just available, not talking about trades, but just free agency, that I felt like I could pay the same and get similar play out of potentially, or good enough for being a backup. I ended up moving on from Walker Little, and I traded him to a team that needed offensive line help in the Commanders. You look at that offensive line that they have for Jaden Daniels, he might die this year. Like, it's not good there. And so I'd like to think that this was a deal that could get done. This ends up being an early 5th round pick, probably where the value falls. Don't know 100% for sure, but Walker Little is a guy who could be a starter in the NFL. You get him cheap, and you get him for your quarterback. I felt like that was fair value. PFF generally agreed with that too, so that's where I landed. Now, trade Luke Fortner as well. The Denver Broncos was the team I sent him to. They did not have a center at the time of this trade, I believe, because they had lost Lloyd Cushenberry in free agency. So they needed someone there, and they generally, from what I've seen, have a more athletic built offensive line. Fortner fits that. He's a guy who's only played 2 years. He does have a lot of experience. Not a great player, but someone that might be able to start for them or at least provide good depth. So I went with the future 6. The value goes down because it's 2025. I haven't even used the pick yet. So that's where I landed there. A weird one was acquiring John Mechie from the Texans. That was a player that seemed pretty clearly on the trade market. This new staff has not cared for him, it would seem. He's not part of their plans. I know Stroud likes him, but he also likes probably 50,000 receivers. He wants a new one like every week. So that's a fair thing to say. But John Mechie was drafted by the staff beforehand. And this was a player that Jacksonville was interested in as well. Someone that I really liked coming out of college. I wasn't scouting then, but you could tell that he had potential in the NFL. He was a 2nd round pick, but unfortunately he was diagnosed with cancer, went through that, and really derailed his career, seemingly. And last year, he just didn't get many opportunities. When he plays, though, I see the potential in what he can be. And so this was just a shot, if I wasn't able to get a top receiver or really add to that room, to at least have someone that I could feel good enough starting to where maybe I don't have to go make a big move just to keep the team afloat. And it was 153. I thought that was a fair trade. And so that's why I ended up doing, but not going to see many trades with division rivals ever, but Mechie was a player that made sense. Chad Muma was one I traded as well. It's as simple as this. The opportunity for Chad Muma to be a starter on this team is non-existent. They have locked down other players. By the time Chad Muma could even be that guy, he's going to be on a second contract. So a team that's actually been very interested in him, or at least a fan base that has, and I think the team wanted him during the draft, is the Green Bay Packers. That was a team that was interested. I've heard them talk about it even on like podcasts recently this offseason. But Muma doesn't have a ton of trade value, but I ended up just going for a future fifth and then doing a little pick swap in the 6th round to move up 10 spots from 212 to 202. And that Green Bay fifth should theoretically be late. This value is going to be just a little bit more than maybe what Luke Fortner was worth. Now, final one here, and I want to say that this is a trade that took place recently. This was after the draft. This was Greg Newsome, getting him from the Cleveland Browns. I ended up being in a situation where I did not like my cornerback room, specifically in the nickel, and it was a clear path for someone to take over on the boundary long term. And so Greg Newsome, he's a guy who can do it all. He could play anywhere. He does ideally want to be on the boundary, but the situation made sense. You get a guy who not only fits in that way, but he is a really good press coverage cornerback. And that's what this team's going to need. So it was a perfect fit. I talked about him on our trade video that we did last week about who we could possibly go after. He's a logical guy. And so huge fan of him. The big question for him, I think, is a little bit more consistency, needing to get that, and then being a better run defender. I think those are things that, Ryan Nielsen could improve if he came to Jacksonville. As far as the trade value, once again, this took place after the draft, so I didn't have 2024 picks to give out, but I went with the early 4th rounder from Minnesota. This could be pick 103 for all we know. I don't think they're going to be a great team this year, unless you believe in Sam Darnold. And then I went with the 6th. So this is a little bit more than what I had originally planned, but I'm trying to find value where it would make sense, because you got fans out there that are like, oh, we need a 1st rounder for Greg Newsome. And that's what you're going to get every single time a player's ever getting traded. The team that's trading him, the fans of that team will say, oh, he's worth 20 times what he actually is on the market. The reality is Newsome's had some injury issues. The Browns barely decided to give him the 5th-year option. That is not a long-term commitment, by the way. That is just simply in case they keep him, because that is not a price that they absolutely have to pay. They could trade that to a team. That's what happened in this scenario. I went with that early 4th and the 6th that ultimately make this worth probably a late 3rd, a compensatory 3rd, but I think fair value there, especially considering this 1 year left where he's going to be cheap, and that number is going to go up pretty quick. So those were all the trades. A lot of trades this offseason, and then you got all the draft trades as well, which gets a little crazy. But Jacksonville does that too, to be fair. The best move here, to me, I just went with Calvin Ridley being traded, kind of going off that whole scenario. This was the best way it could unfold. If you could manage to extend Josh Allen, get the tag on Ridley, and get some value out of him. Because if you weren't able to trade him, you would have needed to essentially have not spent on compensatory free agents if you wanted that pick. There was essentially no one that got signed from Jacksonville that would have helped in the formula, and so it would have been a really bad situation if Jacksonville had just let him hit the market in this scenario. They obviously did in real life. They're not going to get anything back from him, but I wanted to avoid that whole situation so I wasn't handicapped. Now, before I get into actual free agents that were acquired, I'm going to talk about just like who the targets were going into it, because I think that's fair to mention, and also so you get an idea of where I was looking going into this. Mike Onwenu was the most expensive one. I felt like he could be a really good all-around right tackle. I felt like he has the potential to play out there, was willing to give him a big contract. Damian Lewis was another player that I felt like could have his best days ahead of him. He's a little bit more of a mauler as well, which I wanted to add to the offensive line. I wanted him to essentially be the replacement for Ezra Cleveland, so maybe list left guard instead of right guard there. But that was kind of what I was looking at for those players. Marcus Davenport was another really obvious one, just because of the time with Ryan Nielsen, being a player that was a first-round pick. He's had a lot of pressures throughout his career. Sack numbers haven't been perfect, but he's been good when he's on the field. It's just injury questions, and his value is kind of at an all-time low. So that's when you want to bite on those guys. So that was the logic with wanting Davenport. And then Cam Robinson, I listed on here. Like I mentioned before, I was willing to match whatever offer was given. Obviously, there's no way of knowing what the offer would have been. It's not like this is all real stuff happening. But that was probably about where I thought it'd fall. $10 million. And then on top of that, you're talking about incentives. So I think there's a good portion of incentives for snap time involved. And then you got Mike Williams. He was a potential kind of boom player that you could go after. Someone that if he stayed healthy and wasn't injured for the third year in a row, he could have had a big season, been well worth the money. And I needed to add a receiver. And I needed specifically to add a deep receiver. So he made sense. Connor Williams was someone I was a huge fan of in this free agency class. Unfortunately, while I had planned to sign him, he has not signed with the team yet. He's waiting until closer to the season. His injury has really hurt his stock, and it's hurting to know whether or not he's even going to be ready week one, which it doesn't sound like it right now. You've also got DJ Chark, who was someone that was kind of like a backup option. So if we got late into this, maybe after the draft, and didn't have enough depth at receiver, Chark was an option. And then Jeff Okudah was that one-year guy to bring in at cornerback, be able to hold down the fort before hopefully drafting someone or finding a good solution there. Now, that all said, I'm going to go ahead and jump into who he actually signed. So a lot of players listed here, not a lot of long-term deals. I ended up bringing back Ezra Cleveland because Lewis was signed really fast. Cleveland would have probably still been available. Offered him the same deal, a little bit more in incentives, I believe. And then Marcus Davenport, I believe he signed for $7 million with the Lions. I ended up guaranteeing a larger portion. I ended up signing him for twice as long as well, so a little more security there. I figured that deal would be better. Mike Williams, same deal, I believe, as the Jets, although there's more incentives and more guarantees, so have to beat him out. If it's the same, it's 50-50, and who knows where he would have signed. And then Cam Robinson was an incentive-laden deal, so there's a few million you can add on top of that if he's able to play enough. That won't go against the cap, though. It'll be $10 million against the cap, so it was essentially a restructure and a momentary release at the end of the day. Now, Jeff Okudah, he signed with the Texans for $5 million. I ended up paying him just a little bit more. This was actually a move that I would probably undo if I could now. Obviously, I can't, but I ended up getting someone else I felt like could start out there, and it wasn't Greg Newsome. But other guys, DeJuan Smoot, well, he had a bad year. It just felt like a simple opportunity to go out and get a guy that has been good for you in the past and is at an all-time low in value and really just only has upside. You know, worst case scenario, oh no, we wasted a couple $1 million. Not a big deal. Greg Van Roden was a later signing. He's a guy who played pretty well for the Raiders last year, was actually pretty good in all aspects of his game, and could be someone you just bring in for a year to hold down the fort where Brandon Scherff was playing. So is he better than Brandon Scherff? It's a little bold to say that, but he might end up playing better than him at the end of the day, whether or not his career is better, which Brandon Scherff's have a hell of a career. So overall, that's kind of your difference there, but a lot cheaper of a contract, right? Going from that 16.5 to 2.5, $14 million you save. Obviously, the Jaguars restructured him in real life, got him down $10 million for this year, so that was a better deal. Or essentially a pay cut. Now, Tyler Shatley, brought him back for $1.5 million. Cam Fleming, he was that Walker Little replacement. Someone that's actually played pretty well when he's had to step in and start and felt like he still had it, and brought him on. And then bringing back Shaq Quarterman, basically the veteran minimum there. But I think he's still out there or came back on the veteran minimum, so should be a deal that would have worked. And then best move here, I had some regrets on some of them that ended up not being necessary because of draft picks that I made and players that I felt like could have started right off the bat. But Marcus Davenport was the one I went with because there's the most upside there. Like, he could be a really good defensive end for this team in this scenario, and he wouldn't cost you a whole ton. It's a 1-year deal, really. If I want to move off of it, I basically only paid him $7.5 million. I saved $6.5 in 2025. So there's some flexibility there with that, and that's why I went with that as the best move. Now, before I get into the draft here, I want to mention the losses, the guys that weren't mentioned that ended up not coming back to the team. Jamal Agnew, still a free agent in real life, along with Trey Hearn. Well, Trey Hearn actually just got signed, but Brandon McManus, be another one, not for good reasons. But these were guys I didn't bring back, pretty much the same as the actual Jaguars there. And that's kind of where this roster sat. Heading into the draft, of course, Greg Newsome signing on after the draft. Now, I'll go through my selections, kind of the thought process here, and then I'll show you guys a look at the salary cap, because I think that's the big thing here, trying to have some small cap hits, not spend too much, get caught up on where we are, and kind of undo the big spending of the last few years. So getting into the draft, my first pick ended up doing the same trade that the Jaguars did with the Minnesota Vikings, getting 167, a future third, and a future fourth. Good trade, phenomenal value. I ended up drafting Jer'Zhan Newton. If I could go back, I would consider sticking maybe at 17. I think there were some really good options there, but I think Newton's going to be a hell of a player. Could I have traded back again? I absolutely could have. I did not want to risk it, though. To me, at 23rd overall, with some really good players going right before, he was the one guy I felt really good about drafting in the late first. The rest of them is a little more of a question, or it's like, did you really get the best deal? It was hard to pass on Newton at 23. It was one of the best case scenarios I could have had. Now, getting into the second, I ended up making a move up the board. I mentioned earlier in this video how one of the emphases that I would have on this team is to build strong through the trenches and to have a dominant offensive line. And what better player to invest in than Jackson Powers-Johnson, a guy that when I went out and watched him at the Senior Bowl was able to handle everything they threw at him. No matter how different it was than what came before, he was able to handle it. I think he is going to be a hell of a player. We'll see when he plays center, of course, because I think the Raiders just extended Andre James, so I think he's playing guard. JPJ is playing guard, that is. So, might be a little weird, but I think he's going to be a hell of a player in the NFL. Wherever he settles long-term, I think he is realistically a center. But this was a really easy pick. Something that fit what I wanted. It fit what I wanted to do and was a great value at that point. So I made the move, gave up 48 and 116 to do that. I felt fine doing that. 96, given the wide receiver room with Christian Kirk, Mike Williams, and John Mechie at the time, which I think could have definitely used some work. Javon Baker was sitting there. He's a guy that could be an absolute home run steal in this class, might be a hell of a steal for the Patriots in real life. And so just felt like a pick that was easy to make and in the layup there, because he was really a second round guy for me. And then Devontae Walker, I ended up taking him at 103. Technically, I didn't need a starting receiver here, but I think he's going to be a player who proves some people wrong and ends up being really good in the NFL. I think he's in a great situation. I think he's going to be a starter here soon. And this was a way for me to get a very cheap receiving core around Christian Kirk, have some really good depth pieces still with Parker Washington, John Mechie III, obviously Mike Williams starting for this 1 year, probably moving on after that. But this was a pretty simple move for me to make, and just to say, hell, let's take the best player on the board at this point. Now, 110, I took Michael Pratt. Now, yeah, I have Mac Jones as the backup. He's a backup for 1 year, realistically. That's the plan. So you need a long-term guy. And in my thinking, I also wanted to have someone I felt like could start if necessary. If things really did go south and everything went poorly and Trevor just didn't live up to the billing, that I would have an option at least for a guy to get me by. Now, once again, I don't think that's going to be the case, but it's very much a possibility in my mind that I wanted to prepare for. And just in the case that Trevor gets hurt or anything like that happens, I think Pratt is a guy who can step in and be a good starter. And I think if it wasn't for the fact that he went to the Green Bay Packers, he probably could end up being a starter in the NFL. Just not a great situation for him to be in, and probably won't look like that great of a pick because of that. Now, 127, another trade here. 110 was as well. I ended up getting TJ Tampa. He just fell too far. I wasn't a massive fan, but he was a second-round guy, needed depth at cornerback, and felt like, why not take the shot? He ended up going to the Baltimore Ravens, who know quite a bit about drafting cornerbacks, it seems, so might end up being a really good pick. And then the final guy I went after was Leonard Taylor, the third. He was a first-round guy at the start of this cycle. And so just felt like, hell, let's take a shot. You know, we could use depth on the interior of the defensive line. Maybe he can be something. He went to the Jets in real life as UDFA. Didn't even need to pick him, but don't really regret it a ton. I think he was a good pick. Same with Michael Pratt. You know, yeah, he went way later. I think at least 110 more picks went by, but that's not where people had him. And if he's worth that pick, he's worth that pick. And if he's a good backup, I think he's worth the pick. So those were the draft picks. I traded 236 as well for a future 7th. Just didn't have anyone on the board I really wanted that bad. All the kickers were gone. Wasn't really a good situation because all the good UDFAs were already pretty much drafted at that point by me anyway, or guys that were primed to be UDFAs because Pratt was still on the board. The guys I did sign as UDFAs, I went after Braden McGregor. Thought maybe he could be someone who could pan out as a UDFA. Frank Gore Jr. was another one. You could just simply say, you got to get Frank Gore Jr. because of what his dad did for the team. But I felt like he's a solid player. A cool running back to add to the room, and maybe there's something there. And Drake Nugent was someone who I didn't watch a ton, but graded out really well in college. 49ers ended up getting him. Maybe he is something. I think he could be a backup, though, and that's what I have him as on this team, so I felt good about it all. But wrapping up this draft here, the best move for me was definitely getting Jackson Powers Johnson. I did not think there was any way he was going to fall to 43. Just did not see that happening, even getting close to that second-round pick. I ended up trading up at the latest time I could as well, because he went at 44th overall. So the trade was timed really well, and he's just a player I think was worth a first, and if it wasn't for positional value, might have been a top 10 guy in the class. He's going to come in and be someone who really sets the tone for an offensive line. So love the pick. It fit the vision and fit the value really well. So it was definitely the best one I was able to get. Now, with this all said, I am going to go ahead and flip over to... And I'll have to change this screen really quick because I didn't update this before. So we're over to the mock rebuild. Just want to look at numbers here real quick. So this is the same as what we had in the salary cap video. We have names, we have cap hits, we have average per year, and we have the money pushed down the road. So with all these contracts in 2024, end up having about 11.6 million available in cap space at the end of it. And then for the average per year, end up getting about 29 million under it, which was the goal, to get under that number by quite a bit, because I want to offset the cap that's been pushed down the road. Because there's a limit to how fast I can fix that, right? But I want to make sure that I'm working towards it. As far as money pushed down the road, you had some bigger numbers come in from obviously Josh Allen's extension, and then some other guys here as well. Ezra Cleveland added in a little bit, Davenport as well. I think Greg Newsome was one that his average, he ends up having a much smaller cap hit that first year because it's part of the rookie contract, not the 5th-year option. But 74.6 down the road, you know, I think that's all right. The situation coming out of this offseason's, I think, much better. I think it's a much improved salary cap situation and could be getting towards the top half of the NFL. You can see the draft picks here. Once again, all the trade details, a lot of trade details, literally every pick except for 96, which was a compensatory pick we got, was one I traded for. So a lot of moving around, something I tend to do. And then getting to the depth chart. So R stands for rookie, and then your italic and bold is for new players. So at the end of the day, like comparing this to the actual roster, I think the big difference is the amount of experience, right? Because Jacksonville solved a lot of problems through free agents. They solved a lot of problems through getting veterans. I think the quarterback room, getting Michael Pratt as a backup is improved, but theoretically you don't want him starting. You want Trevor Lawrence to be the guy and to be on the field all the time, no injuries. So you can't really count that a ton. Same with running back, Frank Gore Jr.'s. You don't want him to have to be the starter. As far as receiver, I think that the overall room is a lot deeper and a lot stronger, but I think the top is definitely weaker because, you know, you make your comparisons here. Mike Williams to Gabriel Davis, sort of a wash right now, except the only difference is that Gabe Davis is healthier, right? He's on the field more often, but Mike Williams is probably a little bit better of a producer. Now, I think that'll change. I think that Gabriel Davis is going to do a really good job in Jacksonville. So maybe he's a little bit better. I think long-term he would be. And then Javon Baker against Brian Thomas Jr. You know, I like Javon Baker, but not the same level of prospect necessarily. Now, is there a world where Baker ends up being a huge hit and BTJ struggles the first year? Sure, there is, but it's not what you're betting on, right? So the receiver room, I think it's deeper, but it's a bit weaker on the top of it. The only other changes on the offense, really, aside from some depth, is going to be on the interior with Jackson Powers Johnson, Greg Van Roden. I think Van Roden is going to play probably close to what Scherf does, but not as good, especially in pass protection. I think there's going to be a key difference there, but Van Roden should be a little bit better of a run blocker. But JPJ versus Mitch Morse, look, Morse, solid player. He's been a Pro Bowler. But if JPJ is anything like he's supposed to be, he's going to be a hell of a starter for the Raiders in real life and would be on this team. The defensive line, your big difference is really switching out Jer'Zhan Newton for Eric Armstead and Leonard Taylor III for Mason Smith. Eric Armstead, obviously a veteran, obviously a guy who's been productive and been very good. Newton, I think, could have a better career. I think he could be very great. I think he could be elite, but is he that the moment he steps into the NFL? Probably not. And Leonard Taylor III and Mason Smith has more upside. I view them the same going into the draft, but I do think Smith has a much better shot of succeeding. One area I do think is better, though, is that pass rush depth, because the actual team has some major question marks behind Josh Allen and Trayvon Walker. But here with Marcus Davenport, who could be a starter for a team and going into a really good situation, DeJuan Smoot, hopefully fully recovered from his injury. I think that's a better room, especially right behind the starters. And then getting into the secondary where the last changes are, I think Greg Newsome II is a better slot corner than what Darnell Savage is. Now, I think Savage has a ton of upside, but I think his upside's kind of what Newsome is right now, except Newsome's probably a little bit bigger, and he could play outside too. But Jeff Okudah versus Ronald Darby, I think Darby's definitely better. I just honestly didn't even know who he was or that he was available at the time of this. And so if I could go back, I'd take Darby. I think that would be a better fit. I think he'll be a really good addition for the actual Jaguars, but that ended up being what I did. And then getting TJ Tampa's depth, I think, was good. Whether or not he becomes more than that. And final change here, really, different kick returner. Minor difference, although Duvernay is one of the best and arguably the best, but it's kick returner. And then Riley Patterson at kicker. Missed opportunity not to go out and get Cam Little or get a Joshua Carty or one of these top guys, but he'll probably look in the next draft class with an extra 7th. So that's where I ended up with the depth chart. Going into the future, looking at guys that there will be decisions on a year from now, Cam Robinson, Mike Williams, and Jeff Okudah are the big names really that would be leaving. And then you got a lot of guys that are more so depth pieces, not going to cost you a ton. Mac Jones, you're not going to bring back. And then you've got some cheaper, younger guys. So not a lot to worry about here as far as players leaving. And ideally, you want to replace them. My goal long-term with this team is to be able to, in 2025, be able to fix all these issues just through the draft. I would ideally want to not even have to spend in free agency. Now, something will probably go wrong. Something will probably force me to spend in free agency. But that's what my goal is with the future years. I want to be able to just have this team in a good situation now where the problems are solved, and then to just bring in enough talent through the draft and to use my capital wisely to be able to fix problems ahead of time and be ready to have a solution. So we'll see how that turns out. As far as players who are rostered, there's going to be clear questions on the offensive line, specifically on the right side. I would even consider, if there's an opportunity to double up on guard, Cleveland is a tradable player, and maybe that's a way to save money. And then on the defensive side, I think it's really just cornerback. Trying to get someone there that could be locked down. It's a really, really strong class at the top. And so maybe someone falls, but that could definitely be a route to take. But there's a limited amount of things, hopefully, that should be needs. Of course, could there be a need at receiver? Could Walker or Baker end up just not being that great? Of course, we'll see what happens, though. But I feel pretty good about this situation. The spending is in a good spot. It's not too high. Not a lot of money pushed down the road. And after you get out of this 2025 and go into 2026, you see there's a lot more cap space that starts becoming available. And of course, Trevor Lawrence will take up some of that, and we'll see what happens there. Like I said, talking about the extension, it was something I was going to wait on. If I was making the decision, it wasn't time to decide 100% for sure, especially with so little to gain and so much to risk in the worst case scenario, whether or not that worst case scenario was super likely. So that's where we land for this. I appreciate you guys watching. Give me your thoughts on it. What you think was good, what you think was bad, what would you have done? I think it's cool, though, to be able to do this in real time. I'll have the link to the Twitter as well, so you guys can view that and actually see the moves and when they were posted. But it'll be fun to see how this turns out in a few years, because, we get to year 2 or year 3 of this, the team's going to be drastically different. We're going to have some core players, of course, that are the same, but as time goes on, probably going to be a completely different roster by the end of it, and we'll see how it stacks up. Was it better maybe to try to tone back the spending and to focus more on the draft, or maybe get some rookies in early in their careers? Or was that too risky and maybe they needed to go after veterans, and spending more in real life was the better outcome? Maybe they go win a Super Bowl because of it. It'll be fun to see what happens. But I appreciate y'all for joining, watching this. Once again, give me your thoughts and what you would have done. But that's what I've got. Hope y'all have a great rest of your day. And finally, go Jags.